Our first speaker is Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra, and that's how you pronounce it, in case you're... He's the Alice Drysdale Sheffield Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. Among his many contributions, I should point out his very important How to Write the History of the New World from 2001, his controversial and highly debated Puritan Conquistadors of 2006, and lately The Black Urban Atlantic in the Age of the Slave Trade, co-edited with Jim Sudbury and Matt Childs. He's currently writing a book entitled Bible and Empire, the Old Testament in the Spanish Monarchy, from Columbus to the Wars of Independence. Jorge has argued and at many times forcefully argued for the inclusion of Iberian and Latin American perspective into historical schemes such as those of the Atlantic world and global history. His work always keeps historians on their feet, shaking comfortable perspectives, questioning what we think we know, and in some, making all of us work a lot harder. Jorge?
Thank you. Thanks for that generous introduction, and thanks to the organizer, Dan, in particularly for listening to my suggestions. I want to talk today, briefly introduce a character that wasn't originally my talk, is Lorenzo, Hervás, y Panduro, and I bring him up because he's a Jesuit, and he's related to one of the talks yesterday by Cameron. He exemplifies the types of things I'll be discussing today. He is a late 18th century Jesuit in exile. He's surrounded by hundreds of these Jesuits that came all over the world to the Papal States. And in the Papal States, he conducted these thorough surveys of Jesuits in situ and collected this massive amount of information on linguistics through direct interviews, through epistolary networks, and he compiled about 90 volumes in his lifetime of work on anthropology, and particularly on linguistics. His better known work is his catalog of languages of all the known worlds. It's a 6-volume magnus opus, and volume 1 is about linguistics on the New World, and this is the way he went about collecting information. Here you have information about just the Guarani missions, the names of the missions, the languages that are spoken in the missions, the number of people in those missions, and the informants. These are the missionaries by 1767, each one of these missions. And these are Jesuits. He doesn't rely on questionnaires. He doesn't rely on travelers. He goes to the sources. Missionaries that are familiar with the languages. And he assembled in that volume, in that 6-volume work, a total of 300 languages through the Our Father. He has 300 Our Fathers and 300 different languages and 50 different grammars in that work alone. So with that, let me begin with a problem that was important for Jesuits in Spanish America, the issue of the soul. I am kind of in a dialogue here with the recent work on the science of the soul in New England. And there's a science of the soul in Spanish America. So my talk aims to explore other dimensions of early modern information networks in the Iberian world. I am particularly concerned with how information about souls traveled. Bodies needed to be disciplined, coerced, fed, transported, sheltered, and buried. Yet souls were just as important. The same commercial navigational routes and political and transnational networks that moved bodies could reach souls. José de Acosta produced one of the first comprehensive treatises on how to save souls in the New World. Yet the first general manual that would seek to adjust the behavior of the missionary to a given locale was that of the Flemish Franciscan Juan de Fokker, Itinerarium Catholicum, published in Seville in 1574, a meditation on how to secure the conversion of the Chichimec in the northern Mexican borderlands, the formidable, mobile, and ghostly enemies of the Spanish in the northern silver mines. This itinerarium was edited by Diego Didacum Valadesium, a Franciscan, a mestizo Mexican Franciscan, who published in 1576 in Perugium his Rhetorica Christiana, which is a manual for mobile missionaries on how to preach. It's not an anthropological study of a specific place, but he had to contend with the issue of the Chichimec in the northern frontier. And here you have the Chichimec assembled around the Franciscan with the guns and arrows and so on and so forth. And as part of this Rhetorica Christiana, this treatise on rhetoric, he had to train Franciscans and train missionaries as to how to carry this portable information about speech and language and so on and so forth in conditions in which the Franciscan had constantly to navigate negotiations. What kind of items should be brought to negotiating with the savages, because these are missions were ultimately a negotiation which brought items that were interested, the Chichimecs or the northern tribes were interested in. And so here you have a scene of negotiation, which the Franciscan brings the items. Oh, sorry, too much. With him, and then there is this encounter with the savages and so on and so forth. So what items were important to, for negotiation as part of this portable manual of rhetoric, and also the theater of mnemonics, what kind of, in order to remember the languages, he devised these images, typical Renaissance images of using, in this case, Otomi or Nahuatl or native languages. You can see here an application of Renaissance theaters of mnemonics in order to remember indigenous languages. So with that in mind, let me go back to Acosta. So Acosta is a different type of creature than Valadez's and Fouquer's treatises. Acosta's Promulgatione Evangelii apud Barbaros, on the promulgation of the gospel among barbarians, or better known as the Procuranda Indorum Salute, on procuring the salvation of the Indians, was a more comprehensive and explicitly framed, was more comprehensive than Fouquer's, and explicitly framed as an epistemological manual. It began to circulate originally in 1577 as a manuscript in Peru, and was published in Salamanca in 1589, and in Antwerp in 1596. This is a Salamanca edition of 1589. Acosta positioned his book as a manual on conversion that seeks to do away with generalizations about the salvation of the Indian, whatever that is. Acosta is equally critical of those who held utopian, happy views of the potential of the indigenous to be saved, as of those who believed the Indians to be unredeemable savages whose conversion was a shallow veneer for obdurate paganism, a propinquity to idolatry that could never go away. Acosta argues for a middle ground in which prudence, attuned to change and contingency, and empirical evidence should organize the missionary field. Approaches to conversion needed to adapt constantly. The immense variety of Indians made it impossible to come up with generalizations, he argues. No two groups were alike. Their languages, histories, environments, traditions made each distinct and unique. Moreover, the missionary had to be willing to change and adapt to new circumstances. As indigenous communities changed and adapted, behaviors and approaches that originally were considered appropriate would be later dismissed. And the opposite was the case. For Acosta, the missionary had to avoid generalizations and be willing to learn from experience and collective knowledge. Such attention to empirical observation and contingency rule out the development of a science of missions. There is no science, general kind of rules for missions or laws to follow. Acosta's was a call for a prudence of missions. That is, the application of reason to the specific, the empirical, and the contingent. So this is Bacon and Van la Lettre for missions. a natural history of conversion. It is not surprising that Acosta had his natural history of the New World published with his manual on the prudence of conversion in one single volume. So here you have the Natura Nobis Orbis and the Promulgatione Evangelii apud Barbaros. This is not a coincidence. It's a natural history of conversion, just as there is a natural history of the New World. And that happens both in the edition of Salamanca and the edition of Antwerp. Again, the Natura Novi Orbis and the Promulgatione Evangelii apud Barbaros in 1596. His emphasis on specificity and circumstance is reflected in the way Acosta dealt with the problem of Spanish legitimacy in the Indies. And I think he's been profoundly misread by most historians when it comes to this debate of Las Casas Sepúlveda. Positions until then were either to decry Spanish illegal seizure of indigenous lands and political authority, or to justify the latter as reasonable and rightful. This is how the so-called debate of Valladolid between Las Casas and Sepúlveda was framed, or is being framed. On the one hand, Las Casas questioned the authority of the crown to transform the spiritual sovereignty of the Pope over souls into temporal dominion over lands and peoples. And on the other hand, Solórzano argued that papal spiritual sovereignty had been transformed into rightful temporal dominion by means of just war. Acosta saw things differently. According to Acosta, rights were a function of contingency and circumstance. Acosta offered a sociology of barbarism as he sought to identify three approaches to conversion, ranging from the blanket rejection of violence to the full-fledged use of coercion. Acosta engaged in the Lascasian debate on whether Spaniards were entitled to transform the Pope's spiritual sovereignty over all souls into temporal rights over peoples and political authority. But for Acosta, imperial rights were subordinated to the context in which conversion occurred. Acosta understood conversion as constant calibration to the specificity of time and space in which the bodies of souls carried out their existence. Acosta set out to assemble vast amounts of information on natural history and ethnography through internal Jesuit networks, a natural history of conversion. Conversion demanded accumulation of knowledge of local languages, territories, and customs. And in his case, he was the superior of the Jesuits in Peru, so he had access to all this information flowing in through the annual letters. He demanded the religious communities to collect, put down in writing, store, and share information. The missionary to be successful had to be a natural historian within a wider network of naturalists, constantly adjusting information to the contingencies of time and space, constantly seeking to adapt catechetical material, Christian doctrine to local languages and local politics. And this is the great breakthrough with Acosta, as we'll see in a minute. This collective approach to transmission of oral and printed information had to be methodical. Acosta's Procuranda began to circulate in 1577 to lay the ground for Peru's Third Church Council, the most important meeting of both secular and religious to establish the principles of ecclesiastical law that were specific to the Viceroyalty of Peru. Acosta's Procuranda offered the epistemological foundations for the Third Council of Lima of 1582 to 1583, a council that under Acosta's intellectual leadership, he was the man of that council, yielded a vast array of materials in Quechua and Aymara. Catechism, and here you have this is the generalizations of the Third Council of Lima, published in Madrid in 1591, but that council yielded a number of publications in Lima itself. And here you have the covers of some of them: catechism, doctrine, confession, manual, sermons and grammars and vocabularies, as well as numerous guidelines for parish priests for the application of doctrine and dogma to the realities on the ground. So here you have one of them: Christian doctrine and catechism for instruction of Indians, manual for confessions, and so on and so forth. This edition, there is this third catechism and exposition through sermons in Aymara and Quechua. This is a different one from the previous one I showed. This is a manual of confession and instructions on all sorts of issues, a manual of sacrament, of confession and good death, instructions against idolatry, summary of ecclesiastical privileges, regulations for matrimony, both in Aymara and Quechua, produced by the council. This is grammar and vocabulary that came out of that council in 1586. And this is the most important of them all, the grammar and Nuevo Arte, new art and vocabulary on the language of Quechua, one of the most important publications that were promoted by the Third Council, that appeared first in Seville in 1603 and then in Lima in 1607. So a vast array of publications is promoted by this new epistemology that Acosta introduced in his Instauranda. Acosta's epistemology and the Third Council of Lima's model spread quickly throughout Spanish America. By the 1620s, it had assimilated Africa and Africans. Alonso de Sandoval was a Jesuit who devoted his life to converted Africans in Cartagena, a port that received tens of thousands from Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, Congo and Angola. This cosmopolitan port was one of the largest African cities on earth, teeming with slaves brought on Portuguese, Dutch, and English slavers by smugglers and legal traffickers. Most of these slaves were passing through the port on their way to mines, cities, and plantations in the interior of Nueva Granada, Quito, Panama, and Peru. Sandoval did for sub-Saharan West Central Africa what Acosta did for Peru. He compiled a vast ethnographic information on nations, customs, and languages to be deployed by missionaries for the conversion of the myriad Africans arriving in Cartagena. Sandoval's compilation appeared in print first in Seville in 1627, this is the first edition, and in a second enlarged edition in 1645. So this is the new edition of the Instauranda Aethiopium Salute, that is the second title of the second edition, which is basically a theological argument for the return of Africans to this original African church. The Africans are the elect from the very beginning by not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament by Christ. And one evidence of that is, of course, King Balthasar of the three Magi. And here he is, and so on and so forth. This is a larger theological argument, but that larger theological argument leads him and the vast network of Jesuits dealing with Africans in the New World and Africans in Africa to compile these humongous treaties, actually, just like Acosta's, on languages, on customs, and so on and so forth. So, Jesuits cornered the market of manuals of global salvation throughout the 17th century. Even the compilations of Jesuits. Oh, well, so here you have a Procuranda Salutem Omnium Gentium. This is devoted only for the heretics, volume 2 heretics. But Jesuits cornered the market of manuals. For those of you who have been to the Jesuit in Rome or to the Church of Loyola in Rome, will find this map familiar. This is the idea of the Jesuits in all 4 continents. So here you have Anchieta. This is an atlas of 1703 in Munich about the predication of Christ in all 4 continents. So Anchieta is in Brazil, Loyola is in Europe, then you have Oviedo's in Ethiopia, and Francis Xavier in Asia. See this kind of quartering of the world already in maps, in atlases. And which is even more fascinating is that this empirical thrust to conversion appears even in the compilation of Jesuit skill martyrs in the worldwide pursuit of souls to save, sought to give martyrdom a solid empirical foundation. And this is a typical of that. The treatise by Matthias Tanner on imitating the apostles of the Society of Jesus or their glorious achievements and virtues as they sought the salvation of souls through their apostolate, sermons, ministering of sacraments, and the spread of the gospel among the faithful and the infidel worldwide. And so here you have, it's a humongous treatise on martyrs that goes from place to place, and this is the example of Edmundo Donatus, an Irish who is sacrificed in Ireland. So this is just one example. There are hundreds of these. And again, the compilation of information through internal networks in order to make these empirical case evident. Now, the Jesuit approach to evidence and epistemology, however, shifted as the Enlightenment took over. By the mid-18th century, Jesuits were less preoccupied with establishing the empirical foundation of the salvation of souls and more worried about accurate reporting in order to save themselves. First, from the threats of imperial non-Catholic competitors, and later from innuendo. So here, I'm looking at the shift. The case of the missions of Baja California, or California, it wasn't known as Baja, but California, but it's Baja, exemplifies this transformation. In 1757, it appeared in Madrid a multi-volume history of the Jesuits of Baja California, a typical chronicle of past missionary deeds and spiritual glories. Although the book was, in fact, drafted by Andrés Marcos Burriel, the powerful royal confessor, it was presented as a work based on the manuscripts of the Mexican Creole Miguel Venegas. It appeared in Madrid in 1757, 4 volumes. The primary purpose of this massive work, however, was not to establish the empirical foundations upon which to save the souls of the Indians of Baja California. That is not the point. No, the purpose of this work was geopolitical, namely to demonstrate through a careful analysis that California could easily be lost to the British and the Russians. And if lost, commercial traffic with the Philippines would also be lost. Too much was at risk, according to Burriel. Burriel offered a careful geopolitical analysis that drew on maps and the reports of the quick expansion of the British in the Pacific, like George Anson's account of his recent exploits in the South Seas. That is the point. So here you have him introducing all sorts of maps of the Pacific to demonstrate that the circulation from the Philippines to Acapulco necessarily entails passing through Baja. And all sorts of narratives of British and Russian expansion to the north, and so on and so forth, and a number of concrete geopolitical measures that the crown needed to take in order to save this space, including navigating through the 40th parallel or longitude. Longitude? Latitude? Latitude, okay. In order to make sure that this coast was defended and ultimately to stop in Baja for logistical support on the part of these fleets that were moving around the Pacific. This is another map typical of this many maps introduced in these treaties of the natural history of California, and so on and so forth. Andrés Marcos Burriel, sorry, where am I? Andrés Marcos Burriel, for Burriel, the natural and ecclesiastical history of place. So here is in a dialogue, particularly with Anson and other treatises of circumnavigation that are describing the Pacific. He's very concerned about it. The Jesuits are very concerned. The crown is very concerned. What to do? So let's study what the role of Baja California is in this geopolitical view. For Burriel, the natural and ecclesiastical history of a place as marginal, depopulated, and poor as was California was needed in order to justify why the Jesuits should continue to strive to establish themselves in the peninsula. The latter was not easy. Baja had no water at all. It's established in the treaties. There were no trees. It's established in the treaties. There was not even stones with which to build. Baja was a barren peninsula of dirt with a handful of wandering savages organized into 3 distinct linguistic groups. That is the conclusion after 3 volumes. Why could cadres of highly literate Jesuits waste their lives saving the souls of a handful? Why not to help convert and save the souls of multitudes somewhere else? Burriel demonstrated the key geopolitical location of the southernmost missions of Baja. The oceanic currents of the Pacific connecting Manila to Mexico forced ships to inch their way down the coast of the peninsula. Baja was a key logistical outpost in the trade with Asia. Without Baja, there was no Manila. It was Burriel's keen geopolitical analysis that made his multi-volume history an international success. Is this view of geopolitics that made him, not Venegas, because Venegas is a pious, baroque Mexican Creole that is not really aware of geopolitics at the time, but Burriel is, made this into an international success. It was translated into several languages, including English in 1759, Dutch in 1762, and French in 1767. Now, the last case. Burriel's mid-18th century global generous vision of the missions of California gave way in the late 18th century to a different one, local, parochial, overly concerned with establishing the accuracy of empirical detail. Typical of this new approach is the history of the missions by the Mexican Jesuit in exile in Italy, Francisco Clavijero, published posthumously in Venice in 1789. This is a Mexican about whom I've written a lot in my History of the New World, How to Write the History of the New World, but his take on the history of Baja is very different from his take on the history of the Aztecs. It's not philosophical history, what he offers here. It's empiricism gone wild. Clavijero's history is interested in getting the details right. Are there stones in Baja? Are there trees? Are there trees? Is there water? Are there pearls? Do the natives go naked? The purpose in his narrative is ultimately to settle Enlightenment polemics. The Jesuits did not extract untold riches from California because there were none to be had. To the claims that there was a brisk trade of pearls, Clavijero demonstrates that there was nothing more to that story than innuendo. To the claim that the Jesuits grew rich controlling parts of the trade that came from Manila in exchange for supplying ships with gear and food, Clavijero demonstrated its falsehood. A place without trees could not have helped ships to be repaired. There was no logistical support in shipping without coopers to fix casks and barrels. To build, stones were brought as cargo across the Sea of Baja from Sinaloa. So all churches were literally built with stones brought from Sinaloa across the Sea of Baja California. There were no rivers, and therefore little in the way of agriculture and commerce. Details about the nature of the natives matter because they shed light on the lengths to which the Jesuits were willing to sacrifice themselves for the salvation of a handful of souls. Unlike Burriel, Clavijero had no sense of the geopolitical in the Pacific. Not at all. Clavijero's Baja is inspected microscopically without regard for larger narratives, oblivious to any questions of method or theory. Clavijero is the antithesis of both Burriel and Acosta. Clavijero's approach to empiricism and natural history was typical of how Jesuits approached the history of the missions of California and other places right before and after their expulsion. So there is a genre of this for Baja. There's a manuscript of Miguel del Barco, that is a manuscript of additions to Venegas, produced in Bologna in 1770s or in the 1770s. There is the work of Ignacio Kircher, that is currently in Prague, University of Prague. And there is the work of Johann Jacob Weigert, reports from the American Peninsula, California, with a twofold appendix of false reports. This is the second augmented edition of 1772, original of 1771. It should be clear that there is a history to the theme of our seminar, Travel Science and the Question of Observation, even within the same religious order, namely the Jesuits. There are no teleological narratives of progress in any of the changes sketched here. Jesuits like Acosta and Sandoval worked out epistemologies of the empirical and the ethnographic to save souls. They both emphasized the importance of time and space and ultimately of contingency. Acosta offered a missionary epistemology of salvation for Peruvians, and Sandoval another for Africans. Buriel painstakingly accumulated information to save the Catholic Empire from losing ground to the empire of the infidel, either Russian or British. His was an empiricism subordinated to geopolitics. Clavijero, as well as Del Barco, Kircher, and Weigert, deployed the microscopically empirical to save the reputation of the Jesuits from innuendo. Clavijero's was the struggle of the exile and the fallen, not to let others define public memory. Thanks.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Jorge. Stimulating as always. I don't know where you find these things, these remarkable works. Our second speaker is Paula Findlen. She's the Ubaldo Pierotti Professor of Italian History at Stanford University. Her scholarship has ranged from the culture of collecting and display to her beloved Jesuits, to material culture, to the role of women in early modern scientific enterprise. The locus of much of her work is Italy during the Renaissance, a site she has brought to marvelous life in her books, and books such as Possessing Nature, Museum Collecting and Scientific Culture in Early Modern Italy, in Athanasius Kircher, The Last Man Who Knew Everything, a very, very important book, and more recently a co-edited volume, Early Modern Things, Objects and Their Histories from 1500 to 1800. I will also invite you to look at a recent piece she wrote in the American Historical Association's Perspective, which really shows a broad range of activities a restless intellect can engage in that go far beyond another heavily footnoted monograph. Paula's paper today is How Information Travels, Lessons from the Early Modern Republic of Letters.
Thank you so much. And again, a warm thank you to Dan and to everyone who has made this wonderful and stimulating workshop possible. Another way of saying what Maria just said is I probably suffer from historical attention deficit, but one tries to make these things productive. And in any case, at this point, I am going to offer a reflection that I think will intersect very well with Jorge's paper, because this is also a paper in which I'm returning to the Jesuits, but in their intersection with other aspects of the world of the Republic of Letters and of the circulation of knowledge in the 17th century. But I start with somebody I normally don't study, who's Leibniz, who's turned out to be the deus ex machina of this particular project. In 1670, a 24-year-old Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, fresh from his studies, his mind brimming with ideas and projects, and eager to experience the world, sat down to compose a series of letters, with the goal of introducing himself to key figures in the Republic of Letters. Within 2 months, he made contact with two of the most fascinating members of the diaspora of German scholars in mid-17th century Europe, the Jesuit polymath, collector, and encyclopedist Athanasius Kircher, and the Royal Society's first secretary, the Bremen theologian, diplomat, and intelligencer Henry Oldenburg. Both were among the most visible participants in the information order of their age. As part of establishing himself in the European-wide Republic of Letters, the young Leibniz considered writing to Kircher and Oldenburg to be essential to the development of his own scholarly persona, not to mention the building of his network. By the end of his lifetime, he created one of the most extensive correspondences of his age. The approximately 15,000 surviving letters, and these are just the letters to Leibniz, right? So can then envision the tilde from there, by over 1,000 people from the archive of his correspondence, makes Leibniz one of the most indefatigable members of the early modern Republic of Letters, even in comparison with that prolific early 17th century letter writer, Nicolas Claude Fabry de Peresque, who has left us around 10,000 letters of his own again, let alone Kircher and Oldenburg, again to give you points of comparison, who bequeathed to posterity a correspondence respectively of approximately 2,000 and 3,500 surviving letters, far more typical of even the most engaged scholars active in the first two-thirds of the 17th century. Now, in 1670, we must remember that Leibniz had not yet become the quintessential polymath and correspondent of his age. He had failed to gain support from the imperial librarian Peter Lambeck that would have ensured the favor of the Habsburg Emperor in Vienna. His proposal to found a German academy to compete with the Royal Society and the Académie Royale in Paris was but a nascent idea, but Leibniz had vast ambitions. He saw knowledge as a truly global enterprise with the potential to unite the nations and faiths of the world. Already in 1669, he dreamed of what he called a Societas Philadelphica that would bring together all the great commercial and spiritual information networks of the age, especially the Dutch East India Company and the Society of Jesus, with national projects of knowledge to create, in their totality, a universal academy of learning. He had begun his quest for what he called the universal characteristic, that essential key to language, number, and knowledge that would occupy the entirety of his career and produce the calculus as its most enduring contribution. In short, Leibniz was a novice in search of productive relations with senior scholars who defined the world he was about to enter, and he was already an astute observer of the respective benefits of different epistolary networks whose intersecting lines of communication shaped how, where, and why information accrued, and how that information became knowledge. So, what did Leibniz wish to talk about? His May 1670 letter directed to Kircher in Rome discussed their mutual interest, as he put it, in the secret of the combinatorial arts. Leibniz wondered if perhaps Kircher had seen his youthful dissertation on the combinatorial arts, published in 1666, inspired by Kircher's own work on universal and artificial languages. He offered a preview, just in case, of its contents, and spoke admiringly of another publication by Kircher, his Great Art of Knowing, that had appeared more recently in 1669. The Jesuit censors, by the way, absolutely panned this book and didn't think it should be published because they felt it was so devoid of interesting content. Leibniz, on the other hand, felt otherwise and wrote, ecstatically, to Kircher, "I swallowed, read, and unfurled it with great avidity, not putting it down until it was finished." This recent encounter with Kircher's work finally compelled him to write to the famous Jesuit. Humbly describing himself as an unknown man, these are his words, an unknown man, Leibniz expressed his willingness to supply news of scholarly activity in Germany for the honor of occasionally conferring with Kircher by letters. He concluded his letter with two questions that arose from reading the 1654 edition of yet another one of Kircher's bestsellers, The Magnet or the Magnetic Art, and the questions were as follows. Of a book that had originally been published in 1641. So, I mean, this is, old knowledge at this time. But Leibniz, for Leibniz, it's not. This is the point. What exactly, he wrote, was the nature of the heliotropic material that Kircher had acquired from an Arabic merchant in Marseille in 1633 to make his famous sunflower clock? And, second question, was Father Grandamy's universal magnet truly impervious to variation in different locations along the meridian, proving, therefore, the immobility of the Earth? Apologizing for the length of his letter and the liberty he had taken in writing it, he signed himself, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, Doctor of Civil and Canon Law, admirer of your reverend father. Such a flattering piece of Baroque fan roll was designed to elicit a response, and so in late June a letter arrived in Mainz, praising Leibniz for being learned and ingenious beyond his years. Kircher reflected at length on a long career probing the secrets of the combinatorial arts and the roots of universal language with the encouragement of popes and emperors. And this, of course, he says all to Leibniz with the encouragement of popes and emperors. He assured Leibniz he was not yet done with the subject and hoped to see yet another book, his Tower of Babel, in print before too long. He assumed Leibniz had already read, again, another book, his new and universal method of writing many languages, his Nova Polygraphia et Universalis of 1663, in which he wrote he had proposed an artificial form of writing, as he put it, to encourage, and these are Kircher's words, all the nations and peoples of the world to correspond with reciprocal learned commerce. The 17th century Esperanto, as many of us have often called it, flawed as it was. Other readers of this book thanked Kircher for teaching them the art of universal correspondence without learning foreign languages. It's the Rosetta Stone also of the age, or those computer, calculators people use when they travel, right? The heliotrope, he informed Leibniz, was a sunflower, but he doubted it would flourish in a cold northern Germanic clime. Kircher also informed him that Jesuit missionaries traveling to and from the East Indies had tested Grandamy's magnetic compass at sea. And he said, from this, no great doubt remains. To ensure that Leibniz would be fully informed about all his other publications, Kircher promised to supply him with what he described as a catalog of my many books, so that you learn of the good work published by me in the Republic of Letters, or that will be published. Several years later, Leibniz took his advice. Several years later, while in Paris, Leibniz would update his own printed Kircherian index. He received with a handwritten list of the additional works Kircher had published after 1671. He kept this and took it with him in this early period of his life. Like many readers, Leibniz eagerly perused most of Kircher's gorgeously illustrated, densely written, information-packed encyclopedias that rolled off the presses between the 1630s and 1670s. Since Kircher's books were widely distributed through Germany to patrons and correspondents, and donated to virtually every Jesuit college library, they were not exactly hard books for an ambitious German Protestant scholar to find. Reading Kircher's books sparked the seeds of many of Leibniz's important and ongoing projects. His interest, yes, in foreign, universal, and artificial languages, his search for the means of harmonizing all religions and societies, and his fascination with nature's subterranean productions. The year before he wrote Kircher, he told his Leipzig mentor Jakob Thomasius that he hoped to acquire a version of Hooke's microscope. Why? To test Kircher's theory of putrefaction, discussed in yet another book in this corpus, the Scrutinium Pestivus work on plague of the mid-1650s. By 1670, Leibniz's encounter with Kircher's books had already given him a sense of what a fertile mind with full access to the Jesuit information network could accomplish. He was already thinking about how he might utilize this unique community in distant lands to further his own projects of knowledge for the greater good. While neither of them spoke of Kircher's China illustrated through its monuments, which had appeared in 1667, it was yet another book that enthralled Leibniz, and we see this in his many writings. This popular encyclopedia, one of the slimmest of many of Kircher's tomes, relied on more than a century of Jesuit missionary reports from China and India. Kircher's conversations with missionaries who returned to Rome and correspondence with others in the field was the bedrock of this particular project. It also highlighted his ability to examine and collect objects from distant lands, such as the rubbing of the Nestorian monument on display in the Roman College Museum that bore witness to Christianity's early inroads in Asia. Like so many of Kircher's publications, including the books Leibniz chose to discuss with Kircher, the China Illustrata was a product of one of the most eclectic and capacious minds of the 17th century. And yet, as I want to talk about today, it was also a tangible byproduct of one of the greatest and most extensive information networks of this age, the one created and managed by the Society of Jesus. Published in Amsterdam, this particular book would be translated into English, French, and Dutch to reach an even wider audience throughout Northern Europe. Now, in recent years, the Jesuit Information Network has been a subject of growing interest by both historians of science, historians of early modern bureaucracy, and of course, historians of the Society of Jesus. And among people who've worked on it, let me mention Luce Giard, Steve Harris, Michael John Gorman, most recently Luke Clossie, and Marcus Friedrich, who's written, I think, the most definitive study of this subject. The phenomenal growth of this religious order between 1540 and its suppression in 1773 created an unparalleled combination of a well-organized, hierarchical, and centralized administration in Rome, directing the growth and maintenance of educational institutions and missions throughout the world, while also striving to maintain a strong sense of spiritual community and brotherhood. Soon after the order's inception, Ignatius Loyola and the first secretary of the order envisioned the society engaged in what they called a mission of mobility, predicated on the creation of an infrastructure that allowed the general superior to direct individual Jesuits to different locations, best suited to their abilities and the current needs of the order. In the Constitutions, as many of you know, Ignatius described the exchange of letters between subjects and superiors as the best means to make a geographically dispersed order function well. By mandating regular and structured communications between Rome and the Jesuit assistancies and their provinces, he ensured the circulation of news and reports in all directions. As early as 1554, Ignatius responded to public interest in Jesuit missionary reports by instructing them to include information about unknown plants and animals and other curious subjects in their missives to Rome. Early manuscript copies of annual letters became, by 1583, a yearly publication. As the order grew, and just to give you a sense of the scale, at 1640 there are a bit over 15,600 members, 868 houses, with an average of about 10% of this total in missions. By 1679, at the end of Kircher's lifetime, roughly 17,600, of whom 38% are in Germany, if Clausius Dimmers are well done there, and about 20% in Spain. And yes, there are many more Jesuits in the Spanish Americas than in Asia, despite the difference in the populations, in these two parts of the world, right? It is very much proves, I think, what Jorge has talked about earlier. And as a result, of course, the quantity and quality of news begins to increase exponentially from these publications. A succession of Jesuit generals found new ways to be responsive to requests to use the machinery of this bureaucracy to collect useful information. In 1666, a not unimportant year to this particular conference, I think, a few years before Leibniz wrote to Kircher, the current General Superior, Giampaolo Oliva, proclaimed with great satisfaction, "By ink and paper, the Orient joins the Occident, and both the Indies come to Rome." This was the world that Kircher inhabited, and despite his youthful longing for the missionary East, he came to recognize that the Eternal City was the best possible place for him to be. And so in the mid-17th century, Kircher occupied a unique position at the intersection of the Jesuit Information Order and the Republic of Letters. The decision of his society to refuse his multiple requests to go on mission and their insistence, as the same general said, you must stay in Rome, right? The last time he wrote, Oliva says, you must stay in Rome, placed him at the center of several powerful and overlapping networks. And briefly, I just want to remind you that Rome not only is the center of this Jesuit network, but as Peterburg has written about, an important center of information and communication that rivaled Venice in the Italian peninsula in this period, right? Pilgrims, diplomats, grand tourists, numerous men of talent and ambition of various professions, including growing numbers of Protestants, came to this city. It had an extensive and expanding postal system, arguably for a period the best in Europe, that ensued a steady flow of not fast, but semi-regular communication, right, in this particular period that served multiple goals. This is also the world of the Roman Avisi. Political news, right, is in many ways innovated and circulated, of course, broadly. Finally, Rome was a city of spectacular libraries, and as we've been talking about in various projects, right, the role of the library in connecting travel and information and the circulation of knowledge is not trivial. Rome really had emerged. The most important Roman guidebook of the 17th century highlights that Rome is a city of libraries, perhaps more than any other city in this world at this particular moment. So all of these ingredients influence Kircher's ability to be who he is, at the center of the best information of his age. When he first arrived in Rome, Kircher marveled at the wealth of books and manuscripts and mined these treasures for his publications. He dug into these materials with gusto, and he also developed close and productive relationships with Rome's librarians. But of course, he also began to realize the possibilities of his newfound proximity to the nerve center of his society. From his position at the Roman College, he explored the treasure trove of materials in the Jesuit archives and suggested projects of information gathering for the Jesuit general to support. Kircher wrote directly to Jesuit procurators in the overseas missions to involve them in the process of collecting data. He trained other Jesuits about to depart from Rome to assist him in gathering geographic, astronomical, navigational, and natural historical information wherever they went. Think, for instance, of the missionary Martino Martini, who studied privately with Kircher for 2 months before departing for China in 1639. Martini provided his mentor with information for multiple projects. First, during the voyage from Lisbon to Goa on Portuguese ships that included unanticipated, unwanted stops on the African coast, but nonetheless produced information, Atlantic measurements, and observations they otherwise would not have had. And then during his lengthy residency in the Middle Kingdom, and his eventual return to Rome in 1655 in his capacity as procurator of the Chinese province. Leibniz would later think of Father Martini, this disciple of Kircher, as the man, as he wrote, who had seen more of China than almost any other European, though not the whole. Kircher frequently debriefed missionaries and encouraged others whom he knew only through correspondence, including missionaries who wrote him unsolicited after reading his books that seemed to be in perpetual global circulation through this same network, and filled these letters with curious artifacts, interesting observations, and in some instances, entire manuscripts of their own account, all of these deposited in Rome, accounts of a world of nature and culture far away from the eternal city. While Kircher always presented himself as a man in possession of arcane secrets, once installed in this environment, he became a collector of global information. So how did he put it to use? The Magnet, or the Magnetic Art, the book that interested Leibniz, was filled with information about magnetic variation provided by Jesuits throughout the world, in addition to additional material Kircher acquired through the Republic of Letters. The first edition reproduced a table of magnetic declination containing data from the Jesuit mathematicians and natural philosophers such as Christophe Scheiner and Niccolo Cabello, right, older information, but also missionaries in Goa, Macau, Canton, and the West Indies. It also contained information from one of the great intelligencers of this era, the French minim Mersenne, information forwarded by Mersenne from his English correspondence, and data provided by another key member of the French Republic of Letters, Pierre Gassendi. The second edition of 1643 contained even better information, material from 59 Jesuit contributors, including historic data Kircher had found by going through the letters and papers of his illustrious predecessor at the Roman College, Christopher Clavius. We need to perform a similar sort of analysis on some of his other great encyclopedias, the Egyptian Oedipus, the Subterranean World, which I've done a lot of work on, but I just want to give this as an example in a short paper today. The point is there's not a single publication by Kircher that does not reveal something interesting about how he acquired and used information. And there's no question that the impressive range and quantity that amazed his readers, along with the many other issues that amazed them about these books, not all of them salutary, came from the simple fact he was a learned and enterprising Jesuit in Rome who understood the value of this location. In 1670, any careful reader of Kircher's publications understood how consciously and triumphantly he mobilized the Jesuit network. The question on the minds of many other scholars, Catholic or Protestant, was whether this global information machine could become useful for other projects of knowledge. In his studies of Jesuit science, Stephen Harris has frequently remarked that virtually every scientific correspondence contained a few Jesuit letters, and I think we've seen some nice examples at various points, the random Jesuit stuff floating across different case studies. And we really need to probe this issue further to come to a better understanding of what the Republic of Letters thought of the Society of Jesus and how they worked together to create a new culture of scientific information in this period. Kircher's earliest and most important patron in the Republic of Letters was the ex-lawyer Peresque, written so famously and beautifully by Peter Miller, our colleague here at Bard, who created the most extensive correspondence network in Europe, slightly larger than Loyola's, which remains the largest, to my knowledge, non-mercantile correspondence of the 16th century, prior to Leibniz's Herculean efforts. Kircher introduced himself to Peresque in 1632 while teaching in Avignon. Peresque played an influential role in encouraging Cardinal Francesco Barberini to persuade the Jesuits to assign Kircher to Rome rather than Vienna. He also introduced Kircher to other key members of this French world, including his close associate and biographer Gassendi, his Parisian colleague Mersenne, and he discussed the flawed potential of Kircher's projects with an even wider network of French and Italian colleagues. It is no exaggeration to say that Peresque made a young and unknown German Jesuit known to the Republic of Letters. In return, Kircher publicly acknowledged in his Egyptian Oedipus what he described as, and here I'm quoting him, the huge services to the Republic of Letters performed by Peresque, who, as Peter Miller has discussed, never published a word of his voluminous writings. Kircher's encounter with Peiresc and his associates taught him a great deal about current practices of information gathering. As early as 1628, Peiresc, a great admirer of Galileo and a committed Copernican, began to coordinate simultaneous efforts to observe the heavens. And I should add that it's not coincidental, I can't really talk about this in a short paper, that this happens after the 1625 Jubilee. So keep the issue of the 1625 Jubilee and ultimately the 1651 for Kircher in mind, implicitly in relationship to some things I'm going to say. So Peiresc tests his idea, right, of coordinating efforts by having astronomers in Paris, Aix, and Digne observe the January 1628 lunar eclipse to improve longitude measurements for Paris and Aix. The prospect of a solar eclipse in 1630 increased Peiresc's desire to make astronomy a long-distance collaboration. He began to mobilize his correspondence and considered how to expand the second effort at simultaneous observing. The obvious answer was access to the community of Jesuits. I must put into Cardinal Barberini's head, Peiresc told the Dupuy brothers in March of 1628, to command through the general of the Jesuits and other orders, who have monks versed in mathematics in several places in the world, to command them to make observations everywhere that it appears, and to prepare for this a small questionnaire on what is necessary. Now we have the Jesuit questionnaire in play, right, to go along with the Baconian, the Paracelsian, and many others. And to make, right, this questionnaire on what is necessary and the instruments necessary to do this, with the goal of reestablishing the true longitudes of the places of their residence, at least for those of Europe, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and other well-known places of antiquity. Interesting twist on what Peiresc wants to do. When plague and political unrest put a stop to this project, Peiresc did not give up on the idea of using his role in the Republic of Letters to improve observational astronomy. In August of 1635, observers in Paris, Aix, Rome, Naples, Cairo, Aleppo, and Quebec, right, the French Jesuit network, witnessed and recorded a lunar eclipse, following Peiresc's instructions. He used this information to recalculate the size of the Mediterranean, reducing its length according to ancient geographers by 1,000 kilometers. During this same period, his associate Gassendi coordinated observations of the transit of Mercury in 1631 with printed circulars designed to encourage astronomers outside their immediate circle to participate. So, when Kircher arrives in Avignon in 1632, Peiresc and Gassendi are already in the midst of experimenting with new ways to improve observations and wondering how they might involve the Jesuits and other missionaries more systematically to make their projects larger, more expansive geographically, more simultaneous. And here, a few years later, we find Kircher in Rome, attempting to coordinate an ambitious plan that he calls the Concilium Geographicum, which Michael John Gorman especially has written about, to fix the locations of all the Jesuit colleges in the world to improve, yes, longitude measurements and geographic understanding. With the support of the Jesuit general Muzio Vitelleschi, Kircher announced the inauguration of this project of global observation in his first edition of the Magnet in 1641. He had been privately discussing it with key disciples, such as Martini in China, for several years by then. Kircher characteristically expanded the scope of the project to include the collection of a wide range of other data, astronomical, natural historical, anthropological, linguistic. I mean, it's a good Jesuit project, right? The overall project faltered, but elements of it found its way into a series of Kircher's publications, especially his works on magnetism and the subterranean world, and also inspired the work of other Jesuit astronomers such as Giambattista Riccioli. The point I want to make is simply this. Kircher's project was directly inspired by earlier observations coordinated by Peiresc, Gassendi, and Mersenne. The Republic of Letters had actually given him the idea of mobilizing the Jesuit network. In the midst of developing the geographic plan, yet another member of the French Republic of Letters wrote to Rome to encourage the Barberini Circle to make use of the Jesuits for the benefit of astronomy and navigation. On this occasion, it was Mersenne writing to the French librarian Gabriel Naudet. Around 1639, he envisioned the benefits of having the Jesuits in all the houses and colleges throughout the world observe lunar eclipses, measure magnetic variation, and record the height of the pole star. In collaboration with Peiresc and Gassendi, Mersenne was already a proponent of using questionnaires. Would it be possible, Mersenne wondered, to get Kircher to write to all the rectors of the Jesuit colleges to perform this essential service? When Kircher heard of this request, he eagerly assured his French colleague that this project was already well underway. They had thought of it too. Peiresc had been dead for 3 years by this point, but the dream of making better use of the Jesuits to increase the stock of information continued unabated. And again, in a longer version, I would tell you about the role of the Jesuits and other religious orders in the mobilization by the part of the Linche of the information and expanding array of information to help edit what they had of Hernandez's Tesoro Mexicano, right, his natural history of Mexico, in the manuscript that arrived through this very intriguing route. So there are all sorts of ways in which parallel projects of natural history are also performing the same set of tasks that I've shown you. In the interval, right, between Peiresk's death and Kircher's coming into his own in Rome, French scholars had learned that the Jesuit who could make what they wanted to do happen was Kircher, and he had learned from them how to do it. So this brings me finally, in the last few moments of this talk here, to the other side of the story, Leibniz's other correspondent in 1670, the Royal Society's secretary and founder of the Philosophical Transactions, Oldenburg. What did Leibniz wish to discuss with this other member of the Republic of Letters? Leibniz wrote, "Pardon the fact that I, an unknown person," again this phrase, "write to one who is not unknown. For to what man who has heard of the Royal Society can you be unknown?" Leibniz was eager to discuss several things with Oldenburg, too. He had a perpetual motion machine he hoped would interest the Royal Society. He was interested in the work of John Wilkins on artificial languages. Last but hardly least, he wanted to talk about the publications of that other German on his mind, Athanasius Kircher. What did Oldenburg think of Kircher's work on universal and artificial languages, Leibniz wondered. There were many sound reasons why Leibniz asked Oldenburg his opinion of Kircher at this particular moment. So now we have to have another layer on our many stories, which is the story of the German diaspora, right, of this post-30 Years' War, right, and the world that this created in the intellectual networks. Yet I think we can discern a secondary issue behind this query as well. Leibniz was inviting the man at the center of one of the most exciting new scholarly networks of the past decade, the heir to Bacon's, Comenius's, and most importantly, Hartlib's projects of universal knowledge, to evaluate the quality of research emanating from the Jesuit system of making knowledge, as it found its idiosyncratic expression in the work of Kircher. This brings me to the issue of the Royal Society and the Jesuits. In the first decade of its existence, the Royal Society evinced a guarded interest in the Jesuit information network. Many early members met Kircher on the Grand Tour, finding him, as Robert Southwell informed Robert Boyle, to be very easy to communicate whatever he knows. If credulous in his willingness to believe and publish things that Royal Society members considered unreliable. As Rob Iliff suggests, Oldenburg and his colleagues saw the Jesuits as a counter-empire of learning, with lots of data, plenty of it good, but suspect motives. While Oldenburg never corresponded directly with Kircher, his publications were widely reviewed, the most widely reviewed and debated Jesuit books in the Philosophical Transactions, and discussed in a great deal of correspondence by individual members. Kircher's assistant, editor, and most important disciple, Caspar Schott, corresponded with Boyle, while another self-avowed Kircherian Jesuit, Francesco Lanaterzi Brescia, was made a corresponding member in 1668. The most prolific missionary author to heed the call to take up Kircher's observational project was the Prague-trained Jesuit Valentin Stancl, who spent many years observing and writing about the Brazilian heavens and its nature from the Jesuit college in Salvador da Bahia, and corresponding with Kircher. His cometary observations in the 1660s first were published in the Roman journal, the Giornale dei Literati d'Italia, and from there into the Philosophical Transactions in 1671. They would provide Newton with material for critical reflection and assessment in the making of the Principia. The idea of harnessing the Jesuit network for the benefit of the Royal Society was under discussion within a matter of few years. In 1667, Oldenburg informed Boyle that he had received a letter offering to procure for the Royal Society a correspondency all over the world by means of missionaries. While skeptical that their evangelical mission would restrict and taint the information, Oldenburg was nonetheless intrigued. In March of 1668, he informed Boyle that he was contriving, as he put it, a method for settling my correspondence with Rome. Boyle warmly encouraged this move, observing, as he wrote, that Rome was the chief center of intelligence. Surviving evidence suggests it was probably not Kircher, but actually Francesco Nazzari, the editor of the Giornale dei Literati, they had in mind. But the point is, right, that all of this is kind of coming together in various ways. And the publication of Stanzel's commentary observations in both the journal in Rome and then the journal of the Philosophical Transactions is one of the outcomes of the collaboration that goes on. Now, to conclude with returning to what Leibniz is doing out of this, with Oldenburg's encouragement, Leibniz traveled to London in 1673 and became a Royal Society member. He was in the midst of a lengthy stay in Paris, where he did his best to interest the information master of the Ancien Regime Colbert in a wide variety of projects. No job was immediately forthcoming, and later would only be offered at the price of conversion, which was also true for Rome as well as Paris. But Leibniz became a corresponding member also of the Paris Academy. 9 years after Kircher passed away, Leibniz finally arrived in Rome in 1689, and there he would meet Kircher's successors in this distinguished lineage of mathematicians and experimenters at the Roman College, and get to know the very circle that Oldenburg had cultivated. They in turn would introduce him to the latest generation of Jesuits recently returned from China for debriefing and about to embark on another mission. By then, the Paris Academy was experimenting with new forms of Jesuit collaboration through their role in gaining royal support for French Jesuit scientific mission, so that they might benefit from the observations made in Beijing. Peyres's idea had been finally institutionalized. It took almost another decade for Leibniz to begin to correspond with Jesuit missionaries in China, but the admiration was mutual. Having carefully studied the Jesuit publications, Leibniz created his own version of their annual letter with a book entitled The Latest News from China, that he published in 1697, filled with his selection of Jesuit reports and re-edited to include all sorts of other information from the Jesuit missionaries. For over a decade, he supplied Jesuits with news from the Republic of Letters to put to use in the Chinese mission, while also encouraging them to increase, to an even greater degree, the stock of European knowledge of China that he called the commerce of light. Leibniz was, in so many ways, an honorary Jesuit, and he believed science to be the greatest missionary calling of all, transforming Bacon's well-informed but secretive merchants of light into the secular offspring of the Society of Jesus. This, I think, is probably a good place to end at this point so we can turn to Anne's comments as well. But I want you to, again, just sort of think of the ways in which this world is combining, in which someone like Leibniz has really fully understood, much as Peyres did in an earlier point in time, how to make these systems work together.
Thank you. Fascinating networks. Always these characters always interconnect. What we'll do now is move on to our commentary, and then we'll, after Anne speaks, we'll take your questions. So finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our commentator for this session, Professor Anne Blair, is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of History at Harvard University. Her scholarly focus is on the history of knowledge production and knowledge management during the early modern era. It's a topic she first approached in her Theater of Nature, Jean Baudin, and the Renaissance Science, but that has really come to fruition with her book, Too Much to Know, Managing Scholarly Information Before the Modern Age, and where we've all realized after reading that book that indeed there is too much to know if we ever hope to know a fraction of what Anne Blair knows. It is a fact, in fact, it is a fact, because fact recognized, I would say, as early as 2002, with her being awarded a MacArthur Foundation fellowship. And we look forward to her comments today.
Thank you very much to Dan, especially for masterminding this. And each panel has come together wonderfully. This turns out to be the Jesuit panel. So I'm delighted to have been asked to comment. I thought I'd sort of do a bit of a compare-contrast between the two papers, and then would try to bring in some of the broader other questions that have been raised throughout this really very fun day and a half. So I'm a big fan of Nicholas and Barker's new model for book history, which sort of is a response to Darnton's well-known circuit. And they emphasize production, diffusion, reception, survival. And that's what I thought I'd try to apply to the kinds of works we've been talking about. So most, I think, of the papers have been about production. And obviously, that's sort of who are the people writing, what are the circumstances they're writing in. And I'm maybe in the discussion we can think a bit more about the diffusion, reception, survival, which I think will come up at various points. But so I'll start with production. And the big question, obviously, who? I think between the two papers, we've got a nice range of sort of, the Jesuits are an institution, and on the other hand, there are individuals within the institution and the interaction between the individual and the institution. And then we have Leibniz, the honorary Jesuit, or Peresque, who are operating within, on the out, not within the Jesuit order, but trying to tap into it as individuals and then spread that to another less formal institution, would be the Republic of Letters. So I suppose there's always a tension between how much is it the individual speaking and how much an institutional voice. Secondly, drawing on to this morning's earlier paper, who's traveling and who's not. So we've got the Jesuits are these travelers who really have gone far, and although they may hope to return, they are long-term settlers. Their sources, therefore, are personal observation, local informants, versus Leibniz, who does travel, but not quite as far as he writes about, and therefore who are more into corresponding and only within Europe as a mode of gathering, sort of vicarious information collecting. How are they collecting? And there seems to me an interesting contrast between collecting out of nescience, to use Matt's term, out of knowing you don't know something, right? These are the heads under which you are establishing questions with which you approach people or places. That's, of course, the heads are headings in commonplace books, say, it's coming out of a scholarly tradition, but that awareness of not knowing something, I think, is driving a certain kind of questionnaire. And so obviously Leibniz is interested in universal knowledge, and so he's got this long list of questions he wants answered, and he'll go out and correspond with people to get those answers. His vision is a universal academy of learning that would combine commercial and scholarly knowledge. And he wants full knowledge, I think is another term you use, sort of this perfect knowledge. That's the utopian kind of vision, Baconian, or that drives a lot of these questionnaires. On the other hand, I get the sense from Acosta and Baruel and Clavijero, they all have purposes in mind. They want to convert souls, they want to demonstrate the importance of Baja California to global trade, and especially the Jesuit sort of place in that, or to just sort of ward off attacks and sort of, show that they have solid information. So that's sort of argument seeking. You want knowledge in order to serve as evidence for an argument. It's argument-driven knowledge. Dan pointed out that Locke asks questions, leading questions. How you formulate the question is going to determine the kind of answer you get, and you want it to be useful for an argument right now. So it strikes me as two different modes that obviously people then, that's how the authors the producers, right? From the perspective of reception, then people can take arguments that were meant for one purpose and apply them to another, and those differences maybe can become elided and forgotten. One thing I see in common between the two is very much this idea of a spiritual motivation, ultimately. You talk about a secular format, but on the other hand, isn't Leibniz seeking a spiritual and social renewal just as Bacon would? And, of course, the Jesuits are about conversion of souls, and it may take the form of their better establishment in the global networks, but all of this is about social and spiritual improvement, it seems to me. So that's sort of a few points about the producers. In the forms of diffusion, we've got the huge treatises, these multi-volume tomes and so forth, which survive very well, typically. And on the other hand, we've got letters, which are basically the remnant. That's what Peresque does, and Leibniz, most of his stuff is a pile of unpublished material, still quite messy. So letters are, of course, semi-public. They are coterie publication. They're meant to be turned into other letters or into fodder for publication by other people. And so in that sense, and of course there's another kind of knowledge, which is the secret stuff, which is only for rulers' use or to be kept within a small coterie. In all this, obviously, there's orality too, which is lost in the writings that come down to us. Mm-hmm. But I just, they are embedded in these books, conversations. Now, on the reception and survival, we have Acosta work's doing very well. Basically creating the benchmark, the model for works on how to convert or how to basically do a Jesuit colonization of a place. And I think we have these models of Republic of Letters which are circulating back and forth across different correspondence networks. So they're both modes of diffusion are fairly successful. Survival, this is really a question for all those of you who've worked on archivally surviving questionnaires. It seems like that's so often, I gather, we didn't see many pictures of questionnaires filled out. Mostly it seems like it's taking the form of a published record. And that's, of course, the problem with, ephemera or documents that were tools toward a final product. So I'd love to hear more about survival. Just to close off, Paula brought us into the term information. I was kind of happy to see the term information not a whole lot in here, which is great because I'm suffering from it at this point. I've done a little thinking on why we have this term, and clearly it's driven by our own use of it. So OED dates the age of information to 1961. Historians, I think, haven't talked about information, really. So one of the first, for the early modern period, the first books I've come across, Hobart and Schiffman, Information Ages, 1998. Mm-hmm. We've got Darnton, 2000 AHR, his presidential address, Early Information Society, about 18th century France. John McCusker on business and origins of information revolution in the early modern Atlantic. That's 2005. It's really very recent that we've started using this term, and I do worry. Information takes so many forms. We don't want to be eliding the different kinds of forms that it takes. So is the 18th century, Marty Berg sort of raised that, do we want to call it an information age? And obviously, with too much to know, I'm busy telling us, there's information, there's too much information, way back, way back. There are some things that seem to strike me as unique about the 18th century, though, and that's this very self-conscious approach to information gathering. I love the idea that you got to, Ida, from Ida's paper, that you can't just ask the questions you want to ask because you might not get the answers you want, so you've got to be asking questions that will elicit answers, but they look like they're about something else. It's sort of like how you do good psychological testing today. You trick the testee into thinking they're being tested on something that you're not actually interested in. So that's obviously extremely self-conscious and sophisticated. After, obviously, some experience, I presume, and then we have protocols, which are based. So I saw how is experience of questionnaire running created and passed on, and obviously some of the experiences are very negative, with very few respondents, versus others with a fair respondents. So, and finally, I just say that the Republic of Letters as an institution, we value it, we portray it as seeking common ground across religious and social and national differences. And I think recent work by Ian MacLean and the variations even within the Jesuit order that Jorge points out, it should be a reminder that it's fraught with, in fact, religious and national rivalries and individual rivalries and tensions and backbiting, all in the name of the common good, obviously. So there's a not that that's new, this sort of awareness amongst the players that there's a gap between the ideals or what you say, the rhetoric of what you're doing, and how you your commitments, in fact, as you go forward. So that's really just a few thoughts, and I think it's time for you all to contribute.
Questions? Any questions to our panel? No, absolutely. Yes, please.
Is there a prejudice at this time to the armchair dilettante as someone who might be the world's expert on something? In other words, has professionalism not snuck its way in? I made a comment that Abby Warburg was the world's expert on ritual murder, ritual sacrifice. The comment was, he just spent a little time with the Hopi. The rest of his time's in the library doing things like that. So automatically, he's an amateur, he's a dilettante. He can't be the world expert. You talk about the world's brainiest, most knowledgeable individual. It seems to me he's looking at letters, he's taking in material. He's not running around the world or hitting various sources. Was that prejudice alive then?
You know, I mean, yes and no, right? I mean, as Anna has, of course, also in the work that she's done, I mean, that there is such a respect for that process of how you bring knowledge into something to create a project from it, you know, whatever its flaws, you know, those who can suck it in have a very privileged place. And yet, those who look at specific aspects of the quality of what they suck in have the right to be quite critical on the grounds that you're talking about. So, I mean, one of the fascinating developments in the study, for instance, of Kircher and a number of Jesuit authors has been our use in recent years of the Jesuit internal censorship reports, which are really kind of peer review. I mean, they're not solely there for religious reasons. They also often do evaluate the quality. And, you know, they've not been systematically studied and should be across the Jesuit publications, but I can certainly tell you that the issue of Kircher's lack of local knowledge in certain of his publications not only delays some of them, in one instance indefinitely, never gets published, in part because of these problems, but also does lead to revisions in other instances, some sort of negotiation between the local expert and the armchair encyclopedist. In the end, of course, the armchair encyclopedist is the one whose name is on the cover, who's famous because of these publications and because of the way the publications, not the author, travel. You know, this is something I've written about in this book on Kircher, where, I mean, literally, he and his publisher, it's not clear who decides at some point in the 1660s to create this portrait that just says, you know, here he is, his face and name are famous throughout the world, right? They present him as a global author. They're not entirely wrong, actually, to say that. I mean, Cotton Mather has read Kircher, you know, and it's one of the few works that sort of falls outside. I mean, when you look at, so there's that's I think that's some way towards an answer of the way in which both are in play at this time.
So I guess I wanted to echo something Anne said at the end. I find the uses of information to be very problematic, but actually it gets at the question. So people who talk about, you know, data and information now, they are always very precise. That we suffer from a data. We have too much data, but we don't have information because information is meaningful, right? It's a very precise term in theory. And what I've been struck listening to the papers is of our own historiographical moment, which is that we know a lot about a whole array of empirical projects, and the papers have been so rich in getting us the kind of empiricism that you see in the queries. And then we have an older historiography of theory, and it's the intersection of those two that I'm sort of interested in. Both of your papers got at different moments of that intersection. But as I've been thinking both of Joyce's paper, which was a moment of bringing together, and other papers, how we ought to be clarifying these moments of these great syntheses, whether it's the character kind, the very different sort of thing that Leibniz does, or the different genres that you see in Acosta, or a different sort of moment. I worry that we don't even have a vocabulary to do this. We were taken quite rightly by an empiricist moment that we still see. And they capture something about these queries, because these queries go so far as to doubt whether air and water are the same universally. It's truly a deep empiricist, but it's happening at the same moment that Kircher is going to produce a synthetic book, or that Newton is going to draw upon all of that in the third book of the Principia. So this is a long comment. I'm just asking, what are some of the categories we ought to be using to understand this braid of a deep commitment to empiricism, however imperfect, with different modes of synthesizing, theorizing, and other sorts of things?
Should I? Yeah. Well, I think in my case there is only the last phase of Jesuit empiricism that is not synthetic. I mean, the case of Acosta, Sandoval, and Burriel, this is driven by great arguments, and it's synthetic. I mean, it's not empiricism for the sake of empiricism. And in the case of Hervás Panduro, is this great synthesis that is happening in Rome that eventually becomes invisible. This is the foundation for Wilhelm Humboldt's linguistics, and yet we haven't made that connection. which is troubling. And I've said the same for Humboldt, for the other Humboldt, Alexander von Humboldt, who is only possible because there is an enlightenment in Mexico and there's an enlightenment in Peru. And he's a great synthesizer of that, and that is it. And yet these connections are yet to be made, and that is my axe to grind.
I'll try to respond briefly to Matt's comments. Thank you very much. And one, of course, I have to say just about this issue of information. I was rereading, for a different project, I was rereading John Woodward's Brief Instructions from the 1690s and noticing, in light of our discussion we're going to have here, that he prominently uses the word information. So that's a very interesting instance of the way in which that vocabulary is coming in. And I completely agree with you that we need to start thinking about the vocabularies that emerge in different contexts in this period and how they're being used. I mean, that hopefully the work of people like, say, Dan Rosenberg, who's writing about the history of data from the 18th century forward, will at least begin to develop a story about the 18th century. But I hope that a number of the people who are here or engaged in projects like the one we're doing here will all of us think about this from our case studies. And I've been thinking as I was listening to the papers, the other day, and just kind of thinking about the different ways one would do this in response to this question about how to understand the empiricism and the synthesis and what we should talk about. I mean, it's important to say, if we take, this particular encyclopedist I've worked on, Kircher, that if I were to sit down and do a study, which probably would be very interesting, right, of the role of empiricism in his works, it would not be uniformly the same. I think it would very much depend on the nature and understanding of the information for certain topics. So, for instance, his Oedipus Aegyptiacus is largely a textual project. It is about the incredible bibliographic mining of a subject with certain kinds of objects, that also are brought to bear, in that analysis of everything Egyptian, past and present. And then, by contrast, I think his work, his Subterranean World, has these kinds of bursts of empiricism, right? The information about mines that come from the Jesuits in Central Europe, right, is a really good burst of empiricism in that book, as are certain kinds of maps. Certain subjects which, again, mobilize different aspects of where the Jesuits are and what types of questions people are asking to them, either by Kircher or by others, that he can put together. And then say something like the book on China, right, which has the orality, right, because we know he is interviewing people who come for the 1650 Jubilee, much like the Lin Shay interviewed people who come for the 1625 one for their project. And so, I suspect that there would be a number of instances we could really kind of raise this question about when do people see the need for something we would generally describe as empirical, and how would we describe that, right? How do we break it down? So thank you very much.
Something briefly to add. I think there is there is a problem with how the narratives about information and networks is created. It's narrated. Because I would argue, for instance, that Cartagena is just as important as Rome when it comes to Africa, and even more so. All the knowledge that at the time is flowing about Africa is flowing not to Rome, it's flowing to Cartagena, and Cartagena has disappeared completely from our the historiography on Republic of Letters, and the historiography on information networks, etc., etc. And I would say that the same applies, for instance, for Cusco when it comes to information about the Andes. It's the information that is available for the Andes and an eighth of the globe at the time is not going through Rome; it's going through Cusco, and those who are operating there would, and that is clearly the case of Sandoval. This is an agenda that loses ultimately, and loses to Rome. To say, to put it bluntly, the argument of Sandoval is the entire order should reorient its priorities, and the priority of the order should not be conversion of the Counter-Reformation in Europe. Should be the conversion, not the conversion, is the reconversion of Africans who are the elect, and there is a campaign on the part of many Jesuits that are scattered both in Africa, Ethiopia, Cartagena, that kind of lobby with the superior of the order to make profound adjustments to the priorities of the order, and they lose. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that this is a polycentric world that has many nodes of information that see themselves that way. I mean, I don't think Acosta would have imagined, would have thought that the Romans or Kircher, well, no, he's not at the time. I mean, he's not a contemporary with Kircher, but he would have never thought of Cusco less important than Rome when it comes to synthesis. To synthesis. His synthesis is simply as important as any synthesis Kircher might have come up with in Rome. The priorities are different, and the priorities of Kircher have to do with ecclesiastical battles and cultural battles within Europe. But the battles that are being fought in Cusco are just as important for Christianity. So each one of them are playing a different role in this polycentric world, and so Sandoval thinks the same for Cartagena. So I'd say that in the early, for the time, and that would be the framework we need to introduce in our analysis, there is Rome, there's Cartagena, there's Cusco, and each one of them is as important. And we have prioritized, we have given the Romes of this world protagonism that the very historical agents never thought of in that way.
Thank you. Nick, you're next.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, if we have time, I was wondering if there is a concept of network in the period, because it feels like there isn't. And then I thought, well, what is the concept that they have to talk about the network that we see? And you think they will use terms like a commerce of letters or Republic of Letters doesn't quite get there, because that seems to be more about the people. You see commerce of letters or those kind of images, but I was wondering if you ever come across a concept of the network within the discussions. I mean, it feels like there should be something, but I can't think of one. I mean, you know why I'm thinking of this. But is there something in the discussions that corresponds or articulates the concept of the network?
Yeah, did you want to
I feel
jump in
like
on
Beth
this?
does, though.
Oh,
That's
it might see as correspondence or correspondency. Like it's more not a network concept, but a kind of cloud concept of having a sufficient correspondence, sufficient correspondency. Oldenburg talks about it a lot.
And its correspondence is the word.
Yeah, as a noun. Yeah.
No, so I mean, I think that's certainly one of those words in the same way that, as you're already referring to, that Leibniz and a number of others will talk about the commercium epistolarum, etc. And and earlier world, of course, so strongly emphasized friendship as an implicit boundary, right? I mean, that's that sort of late Renaissance world that Anne and I and a number of us have worked on, right? And while that language can still be mobilized, it's less there. So this question of what is replacing it. So yes, I mean, the stock phrase like Kircher, uses the phrase Republic of Letters. I mean, I've never even bothered to try to count because it would drive me nuts, right? But it's just always there, always, less used in his letters, though sometimes, and much more in his publications as a public presentation of what it should be, right? I think that would be a nice way to describe it, what it should be. And I think you're right that this is much like Matt's information and data, that this issue of, network is a convenient catch-all for us to go beyond restricting it to any one of these things, which I think is the point many of us are making. And then the sense of the conception of it, Kircher never, I'm not thinking of a moment in exchange that maybe I will find now in light of your questions, right? Maybe I will find it now, but I'm not thinking of a moment in which he actually sort of defines his sense. I mean, his is such an egocentric network.
Yeah.
This is the problem of a person like that, actually, as opposed to Acosta. You know?
Was the commerce of light, that phrase with the Leibniz and the Jesuits, was that's from a source of his, right? It's from a Leibniz.
Yeah, it's a transformation, right, of this. I mean, like so many things in Leibniz are a transformation of a Kircherian language. I mean, this is one of the things I've long wanted to do is a study of the relationship between the two of them.
Yeah, I would just say right in the lead up to that letter of Leibniz, he's running through basically every metaphor for a society. So society, college, commerce, and what comes out of this in the notes that is that they don't have a good covering content. Mm-hmm. Like there's an emergent social phenomenon, but they don't have a good language for discussing that social phenomenon. And all these things are inadequate expressions of it. He's quite aware of this, so he's cycling through them all, looking for one that's going to be effective. But none of them appear. And network's not going to come around until the beginning of the 19th century. So,
yeah. No, and so then again, this is why, of course, I gravitated to Leibniz. He's a witness to it all. He's the person thinking hardest about it, even at a really early point in his life. And he's 24, he's 23. He's thinking so hard. What is this? What could it be? What will I call it? Yeah, thanks so much.
Being aware we have about 10 minutes, if we're going to give the panel its due time, I'll call on Dan and then a couple of more names.
I'll be quick. A question for Anne. I was sort of thinking about both Fran and Paula, and where might also come in. The annual letter. I'm just sort of interested in why annual. I hadn't really thought about that before this discussion, because we're very used to annual reports. But it almost came up in relation to, what Joyce was talking about earlier about dates of publication and so on. That's an interesting unit of time. Any thoughts on why that might be right? Not 6 months, not a month, not 2 years, not 5 years, but a year.
I think it has to do with Ignatius' general confession. It's an annual general confession.
Thank you very much.
And of course, there may be administrative bleed over from.
Yeah, and it's part of the point that in some ways it limits it because you don't want these damn things every day of the week. I mean, maybe there's also that other side.
Well, that's the thing about questionnaires. If you ask too many of them, people don't answer, which is definitely the situation we're in now. But so if you ask your guys to write too often, they're not going to do it.
But the general confession, as opposed to the regular confession, is something you have to put in writing, down in writing. And so it's a kind of a review of your life, but the life that you have lived that year, and then you have to transmit that to a superior. And I think it has to do with that.
It's a liturgical, bureaucratic decision. And interesting as a parallel to that, I mean, a number of scholars who work, on the larger issues of the society in the way that we don't have also written about the adjustments they make as they try to figure out the optimal time of travel for the procurators, because they have, again, and that is very much about the engagement with the how information, they need them back for all sorts of reasons, and yet they're often having people die. I mean, it's too, they're often having all sorts of problems that have to do with the real long distance logistics of the most remote missions, and they then adjust the time framework to accommodate this fact and extend the amount of time for the in-person reporting so that they will never have a place without a procurator, without a reasonable chance of return, assuming that he has actually made it in either direction.
In the red?
I was just going to say, it seems to me by the 18th century you have the term committees of correspondence. I have no idea what that adds to the discussion or not, just throwing it out. And as a term comes before, and my own knowledge of it is vague enough, I suspect it's a term that they actually used in colonial times, but probably going to be much more expert on that than I am. This is something I vaguely remember. Second comment is, I always wonder when the Jesuits went there to save souls if they weren't in fact saving their own necks on the theory that people who are your religion probably won't keep you. The Aztecs, for sure, limited the territory that they actually wanted to govern. They were not territorial because they wanted to be able to go and capture people from the other tribe or the Mayans, wherever they were getting, and sacrifice them annually. They didn't want to sacrifice their own. And that's all I'm throwing out.
Barbara?
I've been stewing over a question that sort of follows up both on Matt's comments and on Nick's, and I'm not quite sure if I got it quite yet. But I'm wondering, one of the things, I guess maybe it's more of an observation. I was struck by the number of publications by Acosta, because he could have also, presumably, he could have also effectively made his point through the Republic of Letters, the Republic of, through correspondence, right? So I was sort of, already the act of publication seems to be some sort of, to have a sort of meaning that we need to tackle that might be related to the historicity of the production of meaningful information that Matt was alluding to. So I wanted to just sort of throw out, if you could imagine Acosta having been as effective as he was without having published, without having actually resorted to publication, or whether you think the publication gave him some sort of edge in terms of his own agenda. It's just a sort of maybe a counter historical question. And then Paula likewise, and I'm not quite sure where this is bringing us, but I think that this difference between data collection and the production of information also has some sort of material component, right? So I was wondering about these wonderful, comparative instances of orchestrating Jesuits around the world as coordinating observations. If that was, maybe I missed it in your talk, but if that was in fact, if that was published in the end, or if there was some sort of practical difficulty of creating an authorial voice that would have given meaning to that information. And so I'm just trying to think about the relationship between these conceptual differences between data and information and some of the material, perhaps material cultural components to the way in which information gets disseminated. And maybe when it is that when it is that the networks seems to be insufficient. I mean, Kircher is clearly all about publication, although you didn't mention that he does withhold some things because of Jesuit censorship. But I'm wondering with these more scientific projects, it just strikes me about Acosta's empiricism must be so based upon his own network within the New World. That's so.
Well, Acosta has to. I mean, there are two things about his publications. One is the slew of publications that come out of Lima for a public sphere in the Andes that have nothing to do with Europe, and is not interested at all in whatever Europeans Rome might be thinking. Well, they are, but the application here is local bishops, archbishop, through the Jesuits or through the intervention of the Jesuits, are establishing what they consider to be the ecclesiastical law of the land that is different from any other ecclesiastical law anywhere else, that has to be predicated on empirical information about idolatries, about languages, about culture, and so on and so forth. So that is converted into publications in Lima, 1586. This is quite a century earlier than the Puritans in New England. So that is how all the public sphere is in place, like Peru. We should keep that in mind. So there's that, and then there's the other publication that is actually happening somewhere else. It's happening in Madrid or in Antwerp. It's happening in Salamanca, and it's addressing issues of empire. It's addressing ultimately the Supreme Court of Spain, namely the monarch, saying, listen, all these debates we're having about our rights in the Indies are wrong-headed. It's not about the natural law. It's not about all these debates that we have about spiritual and temporal sovereignties. Violence or not violence cannot be judged in terms of these generalizations of Las Casas or Sepúlveda, just war, or they have to be predicated on what happens on the ground. And what happens on the ground is that in some places, in Asia, because he's very exposed to, because most of the expeditions to Asia and China are going through Mexico, and he's exposed to what is happening in Mexico and Jesuits in Mexico. He knows that there are certain bureaucrats and Jesuits among them who are arguing that we need to invade China, to convert the Chinese and conquer China. I say, listen, if we were going to do that, we're going to fail miserably because there's a sociology of barbarism. He assumes that these guys are barbarous, that would make, regardless of the justice of violence, just using violence in those settings would be counterproductive. Don't do it for these reasons. But in other settings, it wouldn't be counterproductive. Actually, it would be very good. So you have to adjust. You have to adjust your policy not to these generalizations about law and so on and so forth. But have to be based on this empirical epistemology, which in turn is applied to everything else. I mean, how to create missions. What is the appropriate way of converting? So for that, the audience is the Spanish monarchy more generally, and so he's thinking not only Peru, he's thinking Mexico, he's thinking China, he's thinking Africa, and to do that, you have to publish in Antwerp, you have to publish in Salamanca. So it's two different audiences, two different ways, two public spheres within the same order.
And you think if he had sent that as a report as opposed to a publication, it would have had a different effect?
You mean he had it written in Peru by 1577, but it's only published when he goes back to Spain, the great epistemological treatise on conversion. It only happens when he's back in Spain. So.
I'm just wondering about if we're taking for granted that publication is the more effective. Mm-hmm.
But presumably there were different positions within the Catholic Church. So he wants to not be, the problem with the secret method is that someone can deep six your report and never read it. Right. So if he publishes it, it will be available for reading.
Well, they are in a battle. The province of Spain are in a battle with Rome. I mean, the Italians have taken over and are punishing the Spanish Jesuits badly, and so the Acosta, among other people, are kind of battling Rome fiercely. It's a moment in which the order is no longer controlled by the Spanish province; it's controlled by the Italians, and the Italians are doing their best to undermine missionary work in the Indies that is mostly done through conversos. The Italians are actually attacking the whole idea of incorporating non-soil lineages, including mestizos, mixed bloods. And that is Italian. That is not Spanish.
Yeah. And no, and this is, the situation in Goa between the Portuguese and Italian Jesuits there, the ongoing issues about the relations between the German and the Spanish Jesuits in the Americas. These are so many examples of that fragmentation of what's supposed to be a unified system that raises all these questions, right, that Anne had brought to bear. And, just to briefly respond to the other aspect of Barbara's question, these do become demonstrations, I think, of the ability of somebody who is part of this order to effectively use this and to work between it to some degree, beyond it, right? To bring these things together. But I think one of the key things that has struck me, and I'm not, of course, as many of you know, primarily a historian of astronomy by any stretch. I mostly work on natural history, but is that. If any of you have ever seen Kircher's Great Art of Light and Shadow, right, the first edition of 1646 has this wonderful Catholic horoscope that actually is an active instrument. It's a paper instrument. You can set it up, and then you can actually show sort of time throughout the world, right, emanating from Rome. It's a wonderful thing to demonstrate. And the point I want to make about that image, in this yet another one of his books, is that it is much like the map that Jorge shows, this famous map of the genealogy of the Jesuits, putting their foot on the 4 continents. It's a way of also demonstrating why it is, even with all the flaws of long-distance travel and communication, it is probably far easier to organize your confreres to do these observations than it is to organize them with these other groups who do not participate in this system. And that's a reason why, it seems to me, for instance, in the successive editions of his Magnes, we have not 59 extra reports from members of whatever we think the network of the Republic of Letters or whoever likes to go out with telescopes, but we have 59 Jesuits. That's what they're able to keep bringing in. So this to me is and this is where this question of how he is useful as an author to his order, like Acosta, like Bartoli, his contemporary, right? He's one of the great authors of, the histories of the Jesuits of the mid-century. How is he useful to his order? I think this is one of the ways he becomes useful in a demonstration of, the power, right, of knowledge in a community of faith, and this, of course, allows it to gloss over the other things. So some of these projects do, succeed, at least on an empirical level, to a reasonable degree in ways that Peyres was having trouble with, it seems.
And final question.
Sure. Okay. I was struck, Jorge, by your description of these attempts in the 16th and or 17th century to create some of this natural history of souls with these different kinds of conversions that were based very much on, local observation and empiricism. And then a kind of story you told about how that vanishes by the 18th century. And I was wondering about that early period to understand it a little better, to figure out what happens in that grand narrative and whether it applies also to Paula's stories and the like. Is there something about, in that natural history, there is some boundedness, presumably, to the range of the kinds of souls out there, right? And I'm wondering, so that this is not a complete diversity, right? It's a degree of diversity and a degree of ranges of approaches, right? What is it bounded by? What creates the coherence of it? Is it something about potentially religious practice, which is, of course, something they're really concerned about? You convert people to Catholicism, what degrees of syncretism are going to be allowed? There's a world outside of the conversion that makes the conversion matter. It's an imperial project and everything else. And if you think about the relationship between these observations and what they're purposed towards, does that change the story of what happens across the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century? In other words, is what happens to this kind of knowledge as it gets produced no longer a natural history because it's to some different end? Is it a story about the Counter-Reformation? Is it a story about the rise of states? I can think of lots of ways that we might want to tell that story that changes how we think about, this move from a natural history world to something else, a science world, let's call it, or something else. And it depends partially on books and travel information, but also on these other outside structures. What is the knowledge information for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you can see in the narrative arc the transformation of power of at least the Spanish province of the Jesuits. I cannot speak of other provinces, but the Spanish province, from a place of power, originally with Acosta, it's kept dominating the order, although it's being contested at that moment precisely, or a few years later, by the Italians. Then you have Sandoval, that is in a struggle to shift the order from this Italian center back to Ethiopia, whatever that is. This Ethiopia that includes Ethiopia, the missions in Ethiopia proper, but Ethiopia, West Central Africa, and Brazil and the Caribbean, the Circum-Caribbean. So that is where the center of the order should be. But they still have the muscle to do it, although he loses that battle, or the republic around him. These are communities. He stands for a project that is backed by many people. And then by the time of Uriel, he's completely. Spain has become. Still important in the Pacific, but he sees the writing on the wall. We need to do something, and so Baja California becomes central to this attempt to hold on to the South Sea. But at the same time that there is this great geopolitical vision, the epistemological project is reduced to this peninsula, right? For Sandoval is Ethiopia, for Acosta is the Indies, for Burriel we better hold on to this piece of land or we'll be toasted. And then by the time Clavier is writing, it's really sad. It's these big global projects of Acosta are gone. I mean, the guy is fighting. It's fighting this battle for details. I mean, there are actually stones or not? Is there actually water or not? And if there is water, there's a lot at stake. I mean, we come across as corrupt and engage in this mercantile republic that is kind of trading on pearls and trading on this and the other. When in fact we are not. But it's kind of sad. So I don't know. The narrative arc is about the reduction of these trans-imperial project, Catholic project, that once had power, to a moment in which it has lost all, well, not all, but a lot of it. So why? Well, the rise of national state, I would say, yes, yeah. They were disciplined all along for a century and a half. So by the time the Jesuits are back in the papal state, it was the nation state that disciplined them.
And just if I take my prerogative as a chair, I might add that it's a narrative of an imperial decline that is 100 years out of phase with the narrative of Spanish imperial decline, where we can trace these same efforts to measure, use a global network of imperial power to observe lunar eclipses 40 years earlier than Pérez, to put lengthy questionnaires and publish paper and distribute all throughout the Spanish colonies long before there's even a thought of a royal society. So they are these tools of empire that are surprisingly familiar, that wax and wane along with the political narrative. So of course it's a small sliver of a grander story of the rise and fall of empires, or however we want to name it. I would argue, and probably if we thought harder, we could create other rise and falls of empires, keep moving us backwards and forward, where these are instruments. Please join me to thank this panel and for successful talk.